Welcome to the Introverted Doctor podcast, dedicated to uncovering myths, mistakes, and misconceptions that hold healthcare professionals back from having better interpersonal relationships with their patients and colleagues. In each episode, we focus on different aspects of a doctor's and other allied healthcare professionals' life, such as communication techniques, mindset, routines, habits, and behaviors, with the goal to show how to eliminate anxiety, trip-ups, and unwelcomed results that comes from ineffective communications. I'll reveal research routines and we'll have some amazing guests in future podcasts that will help shine light on a particular topic. At the end of this podcast, I'll summarize the key tips so that you can apply or reapply them right away to start living your best life at work, home, and play. To subscribe to this podcast, please click on the link below or download it on your favorite podcast app, such as Apple Podcast or Spotify. I'm your host, Dr. Lalit Chawla. Take a listen and join me. If you have followed part one, you'll know that the second part is going to be great. Dena Moitoso is a registered psychotherapist and holds a master's degree in psychology with a specialization in traumatic bereavement. For over 20 years, Dena has provided individuals and families counseling to those grieving the loss of a loved one. In this second episode, we talk to Dena about a subject that is very uncomfortable but important, and that topic is suicide. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in adolescents, where accidents is the first leading cause of death in adolescents. We talk about clinicians and the fact that they have a high risk of suicide. 300 doctors commit suicide in America every year. We talk about mental health and burnout too. Dena uncovers many myths and misconceptions about suicide. She goes into further detail about the physiology of the brain and how different parts of the brain are affected during the whole process. We'll talk about the choices or the inability to choose, a debate that still occurs in many people's minds, and she clarifies some very important details regarding that. She also is very helpful in talking about the language around death, suicide, and there are many do's and don'ts when talking with people, especially if you're counseling people in the process. We talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, the meaning of life. There was so much in this episode with my conversations with her that I truly plan on coming back and talking to her again in the future. If you have ever suffered from a personal loss, you know someone who has, you will find this episode and the previous episode incredibly helpful. Please enjoy my conversation with Dena. You know, one thing that is very helpful is about how our sleep is affected when we go through the different cycles. And I really like the analogy of the file folder and how we can use that technique to make it easier. I've actually used that also with journaling. I've told patients about that, how to decompress it. Could you recap that for the listeners? And
my pleasure. Yeah.
That whole sleep, how it happens, what happens in that time, why do we stay awake, etc.
Yeah. It's one of the first things that I try to educate clients that I serve is on the sleep cycle. And again, it's not that hard to understand, but I don't think that we have done a very good job of getting to know how sleep works. So, first of all, it's understanding that we sleep in cycles, 90-minute cycles. And after 90 minutes, or within those 90 minutes, we go through different levels of consciousness. We enter into restorative sleep, and then we enter into REM sleep. And REM sleep, the first REM sleep is only about 10-15 minutes long. Then we go into another 90-minute cycle with restorative sleep in there. And then the next REM sleep doubling to maybe 20-25 minutes, and so on. Throughout the night, this is what we do. Our REM sleep increases, but we have these increments, these cycles, right? Once people understand that, then they begin to kind of master their own kind of sleeplessness by understanding what wakes them up. So, most common for people who are newly bereaved is to, and again, I can almost finish the sentence for them. They say, I go to sleep at 11, and then I wake up, it's like 1:30, 2 o'clock every night. And they're trying to figure out, what do I do? I've gone to my doctor to tell them about this. I give them sleeping pills, but I can get to sleep, I just can't stay asleep. And that's a telltale mark of high levels of adrenals, right? Like, so your adrenaline levels are so pumped that people are not able to get to sleep. But once your adrenals are neutralized, that's not the problem. The problem is the overload of the brain. So, you know, many of your listeners will know this as well. We have learned so much more about what happens in our sleep. We now know what happens in REM sleep. What happens in REM sleep is the brain sorting through the day's information and then consolidating it with existing information. So I literally think about our brain like a computer and all the file folders and the files. And so this happening, this loss, is so new that it's like the brain doesn't even know what file folder to put it in because there's no reference, right? During REM sleep, as the brain reviews the day's occurrences, it's looking for a way to consolidate it. But given the fact that there has been so much happening in that person's life, I imagine that there is a firework of activity that actually jolts people into the awake state in the second REM sleep. And it kind of falls in line with regards to the timing. So again, if I'm able to teach this to clients, then they're able to kind of go, okay, so there's a reason for it. And that's step number one. People just need to know there's a reason for this. Okay.
And the second step.
And then the second step is to say, now, if we're making the assumption that you are awoken because there's an overload, what if we help the brain unload some of that organization before you go to bed so that it lessens the pressure during that second REM sleep? So what I counsel people to do is to get a sheet of paper, not a pretty journal, but a sheet of paper, and to literally write down their whole day's events in detail. I woke up at this time. I did this, and then I did this, and I can't believe I ran into this person, and then I saw this on the commercial, and then I saw this on the radio. Every single thing that they can think of to write and write and write. Point form. It doesn't have to make sense. Just write the whole day as much as you can remember. And then take that piece of paper, rip it up into little pieces, throw it in the garbage and say, there, I'm done with that day.
And that lightens the cognitive load.
It appears, my experience with most people, takes a good 3 days of them doing that, and then they start to regulate their sleep.
So at least 3 days of doing that.
Yeah.
Because I've shared that technique with people who just have trouble sleeping. They say their brain is too full. They just keep thinking about too many things. And they have found that has helped them. Mm-hmm. Just because... So we must just be processing all the little things that are maybe, not hugely important through the day, but... and we're still processing.
Because the caution here, it's not necessarily to provoke emotion at the end of the day, because then that will create another set of variables. It's really about mechanically reviewing the day, dumping it on that paper, ripping it up, because that's very symbolic, saying my day is done, doing some rituals around calming down and getting ready for bed, and allowing then for your brain to kind of do the rest of the work that you didn't do.
So you would write I brushed my teeth.
Whatever comes to your mind.
Whatever comes to your mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then again, ripping it and making that a ritual for completion. I think the reason that I notice a 3-day phenomena in terms of it becoming more consistent is that we also have to tend to the circadian rhythm and the fact that if you've had bad sleep habits whereby that becomes a part of a pattern where the brain now just kind of naturally wakes up, whether or not it's the REM sleep. It takes a while to undo that. So, but it's good to hear that some of your patients have recognized it, like almost at the right from the top, that it starts to help them.
Well, even if there's no loss, it's just a way of decompressing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of a good nighttime ritual, is decompressing.
But I'm wondering, like, do you find that it helps to help them understand why? Like in terms of the sleep cycles, that sleep education, that sleep hygiene?
I don't know if everybody really understands the why of it. Because when you go into REM, non-REM, it may be complicated. I remember it was even complicated when I was studying it in medical school. So just trying to remember that. But if they're like, I find most people are generally saying, okay, just tell me what to do, okay? Mm-hmm. And if that works, I'll give it a try. Mm. And I have told them, stick with it for at least 5 days. Mm-hmm. Don't put any judgment. It's not like regular journaling where you're trying to process your feelings or anything. It's just very boring kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then I use the example you say. It's just your brain is trying to file these things away. Mm-hmm. And you just have more stuff to file than the average person.
So that's giving them an explanation, right? In terms of like, that's the function of REM and the fact that they have these REM cycles. Yeah. Like I find that if we're able to kind of find the words that make sense for people, that they become much more intentional about this commitment to help themselves. It's the same kind of principle as, most people, and I hear this often, will say, yeah, I'm always being told to go for a walk. I don't want to go for a walk. What's the point in going for a walk? I don't have any interest in going for a walk. But if I'm talking about the benefits of a walk by saying, you know what, people who are in distress are lazy breathers. We don't breathe well when we're in distress. The one thing that is a for sure, you cannot walk without breathing. So when you go for a walk, one of the benefits is that it forces you to breathe well. And when people understand that there's a higher motive, an actual reason why this would be beneficial, they're more likely to engage because now they have intent. Right?
That makes sense. Walking is one of the best meditative exercises as well because it forces you to breathe.
Correct.
And you're out in nature. Yeah. So I'm a big fan of walking. Anybody who lives in my neighborhood knows that I'm walking. Right. And I'll walk 5-10 minutes just because it just relaxes me. It does something. Mm-hmm. And I think it probably just comes down to breathing. So
it's breathing, and it's the bilateral movements, right? So when we're doing bilateral movements, we're stimulating both the left and the right hemisphere. And again, it's scientific, but it's very accessible. People are like, they're sponges when it comes to, okay, I can do this, right? The same thing goes for like hydration, how important it is to drink plenty of water. But if we don't explain why, then they might kind of go, oh, yeah. But if people understand, well, stress is a huge dehydrator. Think about the number of times you've had to kind of do public speaking and you get pasties. Like, everything dries up. So this is the most stressful time in your life, and your body just needs to be quenched. And so, no less than 1 liter of water a day.
Well, I say 3 to 4 liters.
That would be good, yes. So, I aim for that.
Well, the average person should drink at least 3 to 4 liters.
For sure,
and every coffee, tea, alcohol, or juice you drink, you got to drink another glass of water.
Yeah.
I'm a big proponent of hydration.
And our brain is a tissue that needs that hydration, right? So if we don't do that, then how can we problem solve our way out of an emotional experience when our brain is deprived of both oxygen and hydration, right?
Well, even it's ironic in that in the time of a loss that's when, more than ever, that's when we need to be doing the right habits. We need to be eating properly, trying to sleep better, and walk, and to try to process that. But that's often the time when people lose weight because they're not eating.
That's right.
And it's probably it is the thing that they need to do more.
I think that's probably where we have made such great strides in this area of grief and bereavement, is understanding it's not just an emotional experience. It's a deeply physical experience. And although we cannot fix the wound in people's hearts, we can give them tools to help carry that brokenness. And so some of these basic teachings are tangible, they're doable for people, and it's going to help them to be able to carry their sorrow.
I'm all about tools and strategies and ways to, things that you can use.
Yeah.
I think as clinicians and as individuals, the more we know how we can help ourselves.
Correct.
And especially in different times and different circumstances. So, but you can't help yourself if you don't have any knowledge about what's going to work.
Correct.
Right? We may think, let's do this, but that's not helpful at all.
Correct, yeah.
So that's important.
And it's very empowering for people who feel very broken and helpless. If you say, okay, your homework is you're going to drink water. You're going to go for a walk.
Go for a walk. And that's easy to do.
And pay attention to your breath.
I think that's easy to do, right?
Absolutely.
You say, and that's something easily a clinician can do.
Yes.
They may say refer somebody for counselling, but say, if I can give you one suggestion or two suggestions, walk and drink water and make sure you eat. Easy enough to do. Easy enough to do.
Yeah. And again, accessible for the client.
Yeah. What are some factors that inhibit healing, or grief?
Well, I think that sometimes people say, this was a bad time to experience this, as though there's ever a good time. But there is some truth to that, because if a tragedy occurs during a time in which a person is already experiencing major health issues, it really compromises their ability to cope, right? If a tragedy occurs where there has been, family rifts or a disconnect from their community, that can really compromise their ability to grieve. So there certainly can be things that impede a person. And I'm not even really talking about the nature of the death. So, for instance, if it's a death that's been stigmatized, then that can really impede a person's ability to grieve well when they don't have the community support. So that, yeah, there's a number of factors that can influence a person's ability to grieve well.
The one thing I found very helpful was the amygdala. Can you walk through that again? Because that's very good information about how our brain is thinking and processing everything.
Right. And again, we're talking about situations where it has a higher degree of trauma attached to the loss. So again, using that spectrum idea, where it's been more unexpected, where there's been a prolonged sense of crisis, where there's been a violent death, then we refer to it as a traumatic bereavement. And traumatic bereavement, again, is much more physical because of the element of trauma associated with it. And the way that I've explained it to people is that, so we process all of our information via our five senses. And our five senses inform us of our reality. And so, as we experience a particular event, those five senses are filtered through the hippocampus, and the hippocampus then determines, is this a familiar experience or is this a new experience? And if it's a new experience, it will communicate with this membrane that is in our brain called the amygdala. And I have my fingers because I always think of it, it's in the shape of an almond, and it's about the same size of an almond. So it's a very small membrane that's in our brain that is there to respond to the hippocampus's version of, this is new information, we've never been here before. I have never been in an ambulance before. I have never walked into a house where there is danger. So all of those variables that your sensorial has filtered out, now the amygdala is called to action and say, what we're experiencing is dangerous, so therefore the amygdala communicates with the adrenals that sit on top of the kidneys and say, Mayday, Mayday, we have a situation we are unfamiliar with. And so that's what really propels those stress hormones we've been talking about. That's where the adrenaline and the cortisol are now filtered through. And the amygdala then assesses this danger in terms of being able to douse people for a prolonged period of time or a short amount of time. So if we're driving down the highway and it's a slippery road and we think we're going to lose control of the car, the amygdala gets ready to douse us with cortisol and adrenaline, but then we miss it and everything's okay. The amygdala then knows how to restore it. But if we get a knock on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning by a police officer, and this is totally unfamiliar, the amygdala is ready and posed to keep us vertical and logical. So therefore, it douses us with higher amounts of cortisol and adrenaline. Then what happens is that there's another part, so the hypothalamus now starts to kind of bring these components together. And what it does, the part of your brain that says, so, when it's 2 o'clock in the morning, when it's dark, when I hear a bang on the door, when I see a police badge, these all mean high level of danger. It's incorporated the information from the amygdala and the hypothalamus, and then it stores it in our cortex, which is the prefrontal cortex. And I always like these kind of word plays. So cortex comes from the Greek term for bark. And the bark around the tree is where all the nutrients for the tree is. And so our cortex holds all of the vital information that we need right away. And so that's part of the reason, with all of this kind of mapping, that people will continue to be very highly reactive to those triggers that the amygdala and the hippocampus have deemed as dangerous, because it's now locked into our cortex, and every time you see the dark coming, it informs the amygdala, it's dark again, this must be dangerous. Or if you hear an ambulance siren, the cortex has locked that information saying the siren is dangerous. And so that's what we call triggers, right? That's where the triggers come from. And unless we're able to recognize, oh, okay, that's what's happening, we'll continue to keep reinforcing the amygdala. And the amygdala is going to continue to think, I'm pretty sure, dark is danger, dark is danger. And this is where you hear people saying they can't go into a dark house, or they fear the dark. They have to have their nightlight on. Kids will often experience a trauma and associate the dark if the trauma happened in the dark and begin to fear the dark. And of course the risk is that if we don't correct that, then it becomes embedded much deeper into the brain. So again, I actually map these things out for people so that they can see. And I think the benefit in being able to map it out is to be able to look at this experience objectively, to step outside of yourself and say, oh, it's my wiring. That's what it is. Okay, because I know that ambulance is not for me. Why am I feeling the sweats? Why am I feeling like it's all happening again? Because it's embedded.
I think I'd like to get that PowerPoint slide, because we'll put it on for any of the viewers who are watching it so that they can see where it sits anatomically in the brain. So I think that would be useful. I'll maybe get that from you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I want to kind of change gears a little bit to a topic that is probably very hard and maybe people aren't always comfortable talking about, and that is about suicide. You know, if we look at, like, in Canada, I'm just going to make sure I got the numbers right. There's about 4,000 people die of suicide a year. In Ontario, 1,000 people die of suicide. And usually it's in the ages of 45 to 55, that's the highest rate of suicide. It's the second leading cause of death in youth. Secondary, accidents being the first. And I believe that's even the rate of suicide is increasing as well. In America, 47,000 people a year commit suicide, 1.4 million attempts. There's a financial cost. It costs the U.S. government about $69 billion in dealing with suicide and self-injury. So, and it's a loss of life and potential. In medicine, this is just some statistics from the American side. 300 doctors a year commit suicide in America. That is very surprising to me. And women physicians are more likely to commit suicide compared to male physicians. So, do you want to start off with anything? I didn't know. There's no question. It's just a bunch of statistics. But what is your experience with suicide, and how did you get into that work?
Well, so the American Association for Suicide Prevention is a very large body, and they have done a very good job of gathering statistics and doing a tremendous amount of research. So we do rely on the American Association a great deal for information. So thanks for bringing that up. One of the things that they have done also is challenged us with our language. And so it was in 2006 that the American Association for Suicide Prevention declared that the language around suicide is when a person dies, they die by suicide, they die of suicide, but they don't commit suicide. And it's about changing our approach to language because, here in Canada, it was illegal until 1972. So it was a crime. Within many religious sectors, suicide is a sin. And so that's where that language came from, commit, right? And, of course, the more that we understand the complexities of this issue, the more we understand it is the world's largest public health issue. So that's declared by the World Health Organization. But we know that it is a combination of both psychological and biological factors that lead to suicide. And so we're eliminating commit because it kind of creates and perpetuates that stigma that something was deviant about that person. And we're replacing it with the same language that we use when we say somebody dies of cancer, somebody died of suicide. So that's one of the things that the American Association has done, is to kind of make that declaration, and it's penetrating.
Yeah, we never say the person committed cancer.
Correct.
Or the person committed a heart attack on themselves. So that is important language.
Yeah. The other thing that they did that I feel very passionate about is they talked about the element of choice and how people kind of often say, well, it was their choice. They chose to die. And somehow that disenfranchises that person's struggle and the family's grief. And so their perspective is that suicide is the result of a person's perception that there is no other choice. It's not about a choice, but their perception that there is no other choice. And it really speaks to the fact that people who are struggling with suicidality literally see their world from a very small perspective. In other words, their choices seem to have been eliminated. They live in a very narrow field. It's language that we have often used in the past, like they weren't themselves, they were in a tunnel. I think there's truth to those things. They were not themselves. People who grieve those who have died of suicide are grieving for two people, the one that they knew and the one that they didn't know. So it's a complicated grief process. But they were also accurate in saying that people feel like they're in a tunnel, because that's part of this diseased brain process, is that their field of perception is incredibly narrow, and they're not able to problem solve their way out of such a narrow field. So it's not a choice, but rather the perception that there was no other choice.
And the language, you talk about, I wish I had done something, I think people would, or versus I should have.
Well, because
can you talk about that again?
We that's one of the things, the guilt that we feel when somebody that we care about is suffering is all due to our relationship, and we take ownership for those we care about, right? And so in the advent of a sudden and unexpected death that results from suicide, inevitably people go to, what should I have done? What could I have done? There's a preoccupation with the situation, the circumstances that led up to the tragedy. And we're always taking responsibility for that because, of course, we care about the person, right? So there's a lot of shoulda, coulda, wouldas. And they are so punishing. And so there's no question that many bereaved individuals, bereaved by suicide, will find out so much more information in the aftermath, right? Because some families don't even know that their loved one had been suffering. And so it's not until after the death that we start to kind of peel back the layers and realize, oh, these were indicators, or, okay, there's some evidence of a struggle that they were experiencing. And so important, because in peeling back the layers and looking at what that person might have been experiencing reinforces that this is a complex situation. It's not just because that person failed their test. It's not just because that person lost their home. It's because of a multitude of things, because you and I both know there are people living under bridges and they're not taking their own lives. It is not because of the stress of things, right? It's a much more complicated process. So it's important to let families know of this complexity. But in sharing this information, now they're left with, well, I should have known. If I were to have done this, if I were to have done that. So the compassionate language is, can you replace the word should with the word wish? Can you look back at those now memories that now have much more sense to them and say, I wish I knew then what I know now. I wish I would have done something if I'd have known about it. It's a compassionate way to talk about regret, and rather than the self-punishing language of, it was my fault, I should have done more.
There was one prospective study which showed that 23% of interns had suicidal thoughts. But among those interns who completed 4 sessions of web-based cognitive therapy, 50% of them had less suicidal ideation just by doing that. that type of work.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges in the world of medicine is that physicians and I'm sure other allied health care professionals, there's a stigma about talking about depression and anxiety and that. And I think certainly that's opened up more.
Do you have what it takes?
That's right.
Push through this program.
That's right.
Right? So you never want to show your vulnerabilities. The same thing happens with first responders, right?
Yes.
Whether it's fire, police, ambulance. It's a huge issue with regards
and
to...
the post-traumatic stress of all that.
Right.
And I know in Ontario we've had some young potential doctors, or they were there was some loss there, and that certainly has increased the awareness in medical schools as well.
Right.
So,
right.
And I've forgotten the statistics, but there's a high degree of students in medical school when they're studying and in residency that have depression in the whole process. So,
well, if I may say, the other huge risk factors for medical students and people in such profession is the sleep deprivation. Right? So if we don't restore our brain, if we don't kind of have those cycles, then we can form huge distortions in our thinking. So it's two-pronged, right? Like there can be a susceptibility that we now know has some genetic markers for suicidal depression. But in addition to that, it's the way that we live our lives that can also promote those levels of distress. And sleeplessness is a huge one. If you talk to most families, I shouldn't say any because there's always exceptions, but if you talk to most families whose loved ones have died of suicide, they are all able to recognize that, for the last 2 to 3 nights they didn't sleep at all.
Yeah. Well, they use sleep deprivation as a form of torture and war.
Correct.
So it's, And certainly in medicine, that's an issue, and the system is not set up in a way to allow physicians to sleep. We don't let airplane pilots fly if they haven't had a certain amount of sleep.
Correct.
And we should certainly be cognizant of the people who are providing health care, making sure they get the right amount of sleep. Even
if it's 20-minute naps, it's enough to restore the brain ever so slightly.
Ever so slightly, but
not enough.
I'm a big proponent of setting up systems to get good quality sleep at a regular amount of time. Even if there's people who are doing night shift and night work, that we need to have systems in place,
right?
Because you need to take care of people who are taking care of other people.
Correct.
So. Let's talk about trauma mastery and versus support groups. There is a difference between when you should go into a support group and when you should deal with trauma, and how you deal with that compared to what I think most people would think.
Yeah. So let me kind of do a quick 101. So traumatic bereavement is an entirely different beast. And I cite my guru, Therese Rando, Dr. Therese Rando, who's really a traumatologist from the States. And she's done the bulk of the research when it comes to recognizing the unique aspect of traumatic bereavement. And here's the premise. It's not just the coexistence of trauma and grief, but it's the fact that trauma and grief are constantly interacting with one another and potentiating one another. And so when a person has a trigger, say it's the ambulance siren, it will elevate and trigger all of the physiology associated with that fear response, followed immediately by, my loved one's really gone. So they go from this hyperarousal to the sinking feeling. And I call that emotional whiplash, right? Like they're always because it can be the reverse, right? They can have this moment of yearning for their loved one to which then their brain wakes up and says, and why is their loved one not here? And it'll recount the accident. So this kind of back and forth experience is exhausting, and it's the hallmark of traumatic bereavement. What happens with regards to grief work and support groups is that in order for people to benefit from those, they have to neutralize their trauma, right? So first order of business is to master your trauma, is to understand what's going on in the brain. It's to hydrate, it's to exercise, it's to journal, it's to reframe some of the triggers. It's to nail some of those hyper arousal moments and be able to neutralize those. And then and only then are people able in a safe way to join a support group. Grief is highly contagious, and trauma is even more contagious. So if a person goes into a group and they have not neutralized their trauma, they're still not sleeping well, and they're still trigger happy with all of the triggers in the environment, they are susceptible to being affected by the words that somebody else says inadvertently in the group. They will start to kind of generalize and incorporate their experience into their experience. It gets risky for them.
You told a story of, I think, was it a teacher in a classroom? Maybe I didn't get it. I don't remember. Actually, I'll move on. I
have so many stories.
You have so many stories.
But yes, but the support group question is really important, because sometimes, because our access to counseling is two-pronged, if you have benefits and if you have finances, you can access it, but if you don't, it can be a real challenge for families. So support groups, generally speaking, they do not have a fee attached, and they can be really helpful. And so sometimes clinicians are a little too quick to refer their clients to a support group because they can't afford counseling. But if they go into a support group where their trauma has not been neutralized, it's actually dangerous for them.
And you're talking about a traumatic death.
I'm talking about pretty much, yes. But again, trauma is on a spectrum. So it's about assessing, because it could be that a person is highly traumatized because their parent has died after a 2-year battle with cancer. But what was that battle like? What did that person experience through that battle? How many test results came back shockingly? How much of a decline and then a surge and a decline and a surge happened during those 2 years? So we can't make assumptions about a person's trauma until we have their story, right?
Understandable.
Yeah.
We've covered so much ground today. I'm not even sure what the best way is to kind of sum up, but I do think what I'd liked about the workshops, the do's and the don'ts of. Did you say that, or was that just my list? I made up. So there are things that we should do is when we're talking with somebody. One was, listen and be present with them and just be there.
Correct.
Another one was, talking and sharing and reminiscing about that individual that may have passed, and speaking their names, not kind of skirting around the issue. Were there any other do's that come to your mind?
It's about being present, right? It's about taking a risk sometimes. I don't know what to say, but I just want you to know that I'm here for you. Those kind of humbling and caring words are really important for people who are hurting.
And I think that those are good words, like I don't know what to say and I'm just here for you.
Yeah.
Because often we don't know what to say.
Yeah.
And even if it's a tragic loss that is there. Yeah. A good friend of mine, there was a traumatic death actually, and I was at the funeral and with his mother, and I said, I don't have any words to say. I can't. And she hugged me and she said, there is nothing to say. She said, you just being here is enough. And that's really, and I don't know whether it's a male thing, you feel you have to say something, but there is sometimes nothing to say.
That's right. And sometimes we're uncomfortable with quiet, with silence, but sometimes silence speaks volumes.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I know the don'ts. Some of the don'ts is, I know how you feel, right? You said that's one thing to avoid. Now, it's very particular, but say somebody lost their mother, I lost my mother. Is that wouldn't apply there?
It wouldn't. No,
because you don't really know, because it's different for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When you have a shared loss experience, again, it's about this knowing, this intuitive knowing that tells you, okay, I think it's safe for me to say, you know what, I also experienced the loss of my mom, and anytime you want to talk, I am here for you.
Yeah, that's a good finesse of the proper use of language.
Yeah.
I too have lost my mother.
Yeah.
If you ever, that's good. And the other don't was don't change the subject. In what context were you when you said that?
Well, and this is actually quite common. So bereaved individuals, it doesn't take long for them to recognize that it's not always safe to open up because people are either dismissive or they feel uncomfortable. It takes an incredible amount of courage for them to kind of share what they're feeling. If they get dismissed, it can feel like such a slap, right? Because it took so much courage to open up, to be honest, only to be met with either judgment or dismissal. The message then is, I must not speak of this. I must not talk about this. And so that's when things kind of can be complicated for people, because the thing about talking, so people say, what's the benefit in talking about it? Well, what sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom, one of the principal things, is our language. And it's interesting because we are all feeling and thinking beings, and it is all of our thinking and feelings. The minute that we put them into words, it seems to organize them. Almost kind of like words become a code. Think about how often people feel comfort by reading a poem that speaks the words they've been thinking about. Think about what happens at the end of a very busy day if you're talking to a friend and you just go nuts and you talk. Nothing has changed, no problems have been solved, but you feel better because you've organized the chaos. So words in grief are really important. The narrative is important because it actually helps to organize the chaos. Doesn't make things go away. Nothing is fixed, but the person feels validated and organized. That's it.
Yeah.
So when we shut them down, we interrupt that ability to get to that place.
And I remember one other don't is don't compare losses. Because it's so different. And experiences are different as well. So this has been really fantastic and educational. I want the listeners to know a little bit more about you. What do you do when you're not counseling and doing this? Do you have any hobbies?
I love to cook.
Really?
I just love to cook. I will get home at 7:30 and I will cook something from scratch and eat at 9:30.
Do you have any favorite dishes?
Just about everything.
Yeah?
I don't like mushrooms. But yeah, I love to cook. That's probably that's my happy place because it's a very mindful activity. right? I can't really think about anything else
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise I'll forget if I put salt in. So,
good enough.
so that's my favorite thing to do. I really do also appreciate the outdoors, but also from that mindful perspective. In fact, one of my favorite winter activities is downhill skiing. And the reason that I like downhill skiing is because I can't think of anything but how to get down that hill.
That's very good. Do you have a particular exercise routine that you do, or?
I'd like to say that I get to the gym more often than I do, but yes, I do try to get to the gym. But in the summertime, it's about cycling, and in the wintertime, we try to go out skiing. Yeah.
Do you have a morning routine? Do you have a way to get yourself charged up for the day?
Not really. No, I'm not. I can't say that I'm a very active morning person. I like to putz around, and I listen to the news just to kind of get me informed of what's about to happen or has happened, and toast my half a bagel, and off to work I go.
Well, what about nighttime? Do you have a nighttime ritual?
It's cooking, usually. Yeah, my days are pretty tied up with regards to my schedule and stuff, but it's the weekends that I really look forward to. I have 3 grandchildren, and I spend a lot of time with them.
That's great.
I love them, yeah.
Now, do you have a life lesson, or if you were to put a favorite quote or words on a billboard, or do you have anything that comes to mind?
It's interesting. Obviously, my angle, we've been talking about grief. I would love to see it on a billboard. Like love, grief is a lifetime commitment.
Like love, grief is a lifelong commitment. Mm-hmm. That's words to think of.
It is, yeah.
That is great. Did you want to add anything else? Is there any final departing comments?
Possibly what I would add to this is that I discovered this early on. The grieving process is a highly spiritual journey for people, right? We often talk about meaning in life and so on. When a person has been shattered by a loss, it's almost like that part of them has also been shattered. Any kind of value to life, any kind of oomph or any spring to their step. And so, they hear the words hope, and often they ask, what is there to hope for? Well, hope is there in terms of hoping that you find meaning in life again. And the way to find meaning in life is to kind of become more introspective, is to kind of allow yourself to be vulnerable and to explore the introspective and complexities of life. So that, I think, I probably would have been, I was quite surprised when I entered into this field. I never thought about, so I actually went back to school for a year and kind of learned, the psychology of religion and, personality in religion. Like, why do we need to have that? Because we are spiritual beings, that's why. And when we're shattered, part of the journey is about a search for meaning. And that's how people get to the other side of their brokenness, is to be able to find things that are meaningful in their life and that somehow are connected to the legacy of their loved one.
I think that's a perfect place to end, Dena.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So, Dena, if the audience wanted to get a hold of you or contact you, can they?
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
What's the best way to get a hold of you then?
Probably email.
Okay. And that is? We'll put it in the show notes, but
I think that, yeah, because it's like a mouthful, right?
Okay.
Because, my name is not always easy. It doesn't roll off the tongue, but it's my full name, Dena Moitoso, @herbgood.com.
Okay, perfect. I will put that in the show notes, and you've been splendid. And
you're so kind. Thank you.
I really enjoyed this. I really did. And thank you again for everything.
You're most welcome. My pleasure.